Now to get more of the story from Washington to Edwin Newman in Washington.
NBC News correspondent Nancy Dickerson is stationed in Lafayette Park across from the White House. Now to Nancy Dickerson.
It's only right that it rains in Washington today because the pall that has already settled over the city is so bad that nothing could be much worse. There are several lines of people across the street from the White House. They're holding umbrellas, and they, too, are drenched. They're not saying much. They're just holding a faithful vigil. There are really two centers of activity here as you stand and watch across the street from the White House. One is in President Johnson's office. His old office is the Vice President, in the Executive Office building. Now, the other one is in the White House, centering around the Press Secretary's office. And the activity goes back and forth between these two places. For the time being, President Johnson's office is deferring to the White House operation, and all official acknowledgments are coming from there. Mr. Johnson's office is a very, very busy place. The phones are ringing constantly. Secret Service are preventing most people from trying to get up there. Interesting thing about Mr. Johnson's telephone situation is that he always believed that even the Vice President of the United States should have his private personal telephone number listed in the telephone book. He has always adhered to that until last night when you called the Johnson home. An operator came in and said all those calls are being referred to the White House. That number is National 81414. So for the first time since he's been in public office, President Johnson does not have his private phone listed in the telephone. Well, as is well known, the speech that President Kennedy was to deliver in Dallas yesterday concerned in part the TFX fighter plane. Just before Mr. Kennedy, left for Dallas, he had called Deputy Secretary of Defense Oswald Gilpatrick, who for a few days had been under fire by a somewhat hostile committee on Capitol Hill concerning the TFX fighter plane. Mr. Kennedy called to congratulate Gilpatrick and said he had done well and said, "Don't be concerned about the criticism. After all," said Mr. Kennedy, "I've been criticized a lot, too." This is Nancy Dickerson of NBC News at Lafayette Park across the street from the White House in Washington.
And there's more word from Dallas about pro-communist Lee Harvey Oswald. He's arrogant, he's still in handcuffs, he's charged with the assassination of President Kennedy. Police said paraffin results on his hands were positive. They began questioning him again. This would indicate that he had fired a rifle. And Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry said Oswald's mood ever since he's been held has been very arrogant. He doesn't answer questions directly. He just says, "That's ridiculous," and "That's silly." Chief Curry disclosed that a substantial amount of communist literature had been found in Oswald's rooms. He didn't specify what the literature was. Chief Curry said there were 3 witnesses to the shooting, and police were looking for a man who was reported to have picked Oswald up after the shooting. Curry said the Dallas police had not known Oswald was in town. It's customary, Curry said, for the FBI to notify local police when someone with a subversive background arrives in the area. Curry said Oswald has no lawyer. He understands that Oswald's mother is arranging for one. He said the Civil Liberties Union called and wanted to know if Oswald had been informed of his rights. Oswald is a Marxist, a Castro sympathizer. He calmly ate a breakfast of oatmeal, apricots, bread, and coffee. Paraffin results on Oswald's face were not available, although we had the report of the paraffin tests on his hands.
We go to Tom Perryman, station WFAA in Dallas.
We have information now from the Dallas Police Headquarters. One of our men reports a taxi cab driver is now being questioned. The cab driver is alleged to have picked up Oswald, the accused slayer of President Kennedy, somewhere between the area where President Kennedy was shot and Oak Cliff, his home. The suspect, Oswald, is alleged to have taken a bus about halfway to his home in Oak Cliff, just across the river from the downtown Dallas area, where he took a cab from there to his home. He changed clothes there and went to the theater a short time later. Also from Dallas, the county judge, Lou Sterrett, is going to meet with the mayor, Earl Cavill, as soon as he can, possibly today or tomorrow. He is proposing the erection of a monument at the spot or near the spot where John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in downtown Dallas. This is Tom Perryman at WFAA reporting for NBC News.
We also repeat a story received from the Defense Department earlier that Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, the man being held, once wrote to Texas Governor John Connally from Russia, pleading that his undesirable discharge be reversed. The exact date of that letter not known, but presumably it was while Connally was serving as President Kennedy's first Secretary of the Navy. All of which raises a new question whether the real target of the assault was Mr. Kennedy or Governor Connally. The two were riding with their wives in the presidential car when 3 shots rang out from that high-powered rifle from a high-level window overlooking the parade route. Mr. Connally was seriously injured, but is in satisfactory condition now. The president, of course, killed in that assault. And this just in from Dallas, Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz said today, the assassination case against Lee Harvey Oswald is cinched. He said flatly, this is the man that killed President Kennedy. 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald being held in Dallas, Texas, for the assassination of the president. Now we try again for NBC's Robert McCormick in Washington.
Robert McCormick is taking a brief time off. This is Edwin Newman. What were you hoping to hear from us? Reaction perhaps to the news that the police officer in Dallas has said that the case against Oswald is cinched. That is a rather extraordinary thing to say at a time like this, and they must have certainly what evidence they consider conclusive against Oswald. I wonder what they have learned that they did not tell us about earlier. Have you heard anything on that?
Edwin, we're waiting for a pickup now from Dallas on this later development. It does seem a little odd that the case is cinched this early.
They have perhaps made other tests. They had given us earlier, you remember, the results of the paraffin tests on the hands. They had not given us the result of the paraffin tests on the face. The tests on the hands had shown, they said, that Oswald had fired a rifle. The tests on the face presumably would have shown something more. I just want to say that we've had a further statement from the homicide chief in Dallas, Captain Will Fritz, the man who said the assassination case against Oswald was cinched, and who said this man killed President Kennedy. He also said, without going into the evidence, I can tell you this. This case is cinched. This man killed President Kennedy. We are convinced without any doubt he did the killing. There were no accomplices. So the homicide chief of the Dallas police has said that he is convinced that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy and that he did it without help from anyone else. Now, Russ, earlier today they had revealed that they had arrested a second man and were questioning him. Do you judge from this, then, that they have deduced that the second man was not connected with the crime?
Ed, allow me to interrupt you. We go right now to Tom Pettit with later developments on this story. Tom Pettit in Dallas.
Here's an example of the detail work going on. Captain Will Fritz of Homicide, who's heading the investigation, said they now have found out that Oswald left the book depository store from which the fatal bullets were fired at President Kennedy. That he's headed toward home, that he first took a bus, finding it too slow, switched to a cab. Then he went to his apartment, changed clothes, and went to the movie theater, where he later was apprehended after allegedly killing a Dallas police officer. They have located the cab driver. They have located the bus driver. These are 2 of the many witnesses who are being interrogated in building the case. Fritz, in his first appearance a few moments ago before newsmen, said it is a cinch case. This is Captain Fritz, head of the homicide squad, who's been conducting the investigation and interrogation. Captain, can you give us a resume of what you now know concerning the assassination of the president and Mr. Oswald's role in it?
There's only one thing that I can tell you. Without going into the evidence, before first talking to the district attorney, I can tell you that this case is cinched, that this man killed the president.
Captain Fritz says it is a cinched case. District Attorney Wade was asked if he thinks it is a cinched case. He said there is no such thing when there are 12 jurors involved, but it is, he says, a very good case against Lee Oswald. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, reporting from Dallas Police Headquarters.
So you have just heard a pickup from Dallas with NBC's Tom Pettit, in which Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz said today the assassination case against the president is cinched, that Lee Harvey Oswald is the man who killed the president. Again, we are quoting Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz. Further developments from Washington now as we go back to Edwin Newman.
Russ, I wanted to put a question to you that I hoped you might be able to put to Tom Pettit. We have had the statement of the homicide chief in Dallas, Captain Fritz, that the case is a cinch. It has been cinched, and that Oswald is the man who killed President Kennedy, and that he did it alone. There were no accomplices. Has Tom Pettit, and I know what difficulties he's laboring under, been able to get any kind of indication from the people in charge of the case as to what the motivation of Oswald was? You suggested earlier this afternoon that it was at least conceivable that it was Governor Connally of Texas against whom Oswald was acting, if indeed he did act. Have you heard anything more about that?
We have not, Edwin. The basis for that speculation comes from Dallas, and it is based on the fact that Oswald had written a letter to Connally at an unspecified time, possibly while Connally was serving as President Kennedy's Secretary of the Navy, in which Oswald is said to have objected strenuously to some ill deed he felt was done to him while he was in uniform. Apparently, he held the governor of Texas responsible for this, and there has been the suggestion that perhaps Connally was the target for the assassination bullet. Again, we must repeat that Oswald declares his innocence. He has not confessed to anything. He has declined to take a lie detector test. And while Homicide Chief Fritz has said the case is cinched, Oswald himself says he is innocent, and the man has not yet gone to trial. So we simply pass along the latest development we get from Dallas. On the question of evidence, we have expect to hear from Pettit again momentarily, in which perhaps we can get further elaboration on that. I would assume, Edwin, that any additional evidence that may be held against Oswald will be held until the case comes to trial, that they certainly would not want to try the case on radio or television.
No, quite. They must hold the evidence, and I suppose there would be people in other countries whose judicial and legal systems are different from ours who would be shocked that even this statement has been made, that the police officer in charge of the case says, in effect, that Oswald is guilty. There are other countries that would not permit that to be said, would not permit us to say it on radio or television or in the newspapers.
It does seem unusual in that but there is a possibility of a mistrial when such statements are made before the man goes before a jury.
I suppose we're getting perhaps too far ahead of the story, but I suppose Oswald's lawyer would almost automatically say it would be difficult, if not impossible, for him to get a fair trial in view of everything that has been said. Still, it is part of our legal system to see to it that he does get a fair trial, and as you have emphasized, and rightly, he is innocent until proved guilty.
We might mention in this connection, Edwin, allow me to interrupt, that with the nationwide publicity that has been given Oswald's arrest, a change of venue would seem to me, and I speak strictly from the viewpoint of a layman, a change of venue would be impossible. That the name Lee Harvey Oswald is known now from coast to coast. Is there such a thing as granting a impartial jury to this man anywhere in the country?
Well, I think we may say this, that in a case of the surpassing importance and somberness that this one will have, whoever might be tried in connection with such a crime, any jury would surely want to give the most sober sort of attention to the case before it. I think any jury would go into such a case with the most serious intentions and with the deepest responsibilities, and we should be able to count on that.
Edwin, allow me to interrupt this just a moment now. As we get further developments from abroad, we go to John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
From our vantage point here in West Berlin, several important themes of communist reaction emerged today in connection with the death of the president. The point of most immediate importance to the people of the United States is that the Cold War apparently is not going to turn hot overnight because John F. Kennedy is gone and Lyndon Johnson has taken his place. There are several reasons for this. One is the great length to which Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union has gone to demonstrate publicly sorrow and shock over the death of the president. He was echoed in these demonstrations by the highest range of Soviet officials, including an influential and unofficial personality, Mrs. Khrushchev. Premier Khrushchev went beyond telegraphing his condolences today. Moscow let it be known that he returned to Moscow especially from an out-of-town trip so that he could call on the American ambassador for a personal demonstration of his feelings. On top of that, the Soviets are sending First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan to President Kennedy's funeral. Mikoyan serves a double purpose. He is an old and canny Armenian negotiator who has always got along very well with Americans, and he is a man of exalted rank in the Soviet hierarchy. Moreover, the governmental leaders of the East Bloc satellites and their propaganda organizations have been relatively profuse in their messages of condolence and their reporting of the president's death. This applies to some very tough characters in the communist world, including Antonin Novotny of Czechoslovakia and Walter Ulrich of East Germany. Both have sent messages to Washington, and the leading newspaper in East Germany, Neues Deutschland, turned over a remarkably large portion of its front page today to the Kennedy story. In Moscow, the Russians have borrowed film of Mr. Kennedy from the American embassy vaults, and a special obituary program on the late president is now being prepared for Moscow television. President Johnson is described in Moscow tonight as more conservative than Mr. Kennedy, but Moscow says that the policies of the Kennedy administration will be continued. Among other important things to recall, however, about the communist position is the fact, which must be exceedingly uncomfortable to communist propagandists, the fact that the man accused of murdering Mr. Kennedy has described himself as a Marxist and, according to one report, as a communist. Furthermore, the man has lived in the Soviet Union, reportedly sought Soviet citizenship, and married a Russian girl. Now, this poses a propaganda hurdle of gigantic magnitude for the communists, who were very quick off the mark to charge that the president had been killed by a right-wing American racist. So far, the communists have not tried to get over the hurdle, and no one in the Soviet Union, for example, has been told in any specific way of these details about Lee Harvey Oswald. But the voice of America is no longer jammed in Russia, and the people of that country are bound to get the word one way or another. So the Russians have a bad problem. They are beginning to work at a solution. Both the Soviet news agency TASS and Moscow Radio Home Service have called the case against Oswald a suspicious one, and they are jibing about the so-called police story of left-wing elements being involved, end quote. Finally, in their eulogies to the president, the universal communist line is that the world has lost a man who was working toward a relaxation of international tension. And, of course, so he was. But by this tactic, the communists are making it possible to say, look, we got along with President Kennedy, and we said so when he died, but we can't get along with President Johnson. The Russians can say that if they want to. We don't know if they will or not. All we can say now is that on the basis of the evidence here tonight, the Cold War will not get a lot hotter tomorrow. John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
This is Edwin Newman in the NBC Newsroom in New York. Ellie Abel is here with a late report about the funeral plans, the burial plans for President Kennedy.
Up to now, there has been no decision announced on where the president is to be buried. It had been assumed he would be buried in the family plot at Brookline, Massachusetts, where he was born. However, we've just had a report that the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, his brother, was at Arlington National Cemetery this morning, escorted by Defense Secretary McNamara, looking at potential grave sites. So there is this possibility, still unconfirmed, that the president will be buried in the National Cemetery. He is, of course, an accredited and decorated hero from his service in the Navy during the war, and if buried there, would lie alongside so many of his comrades in arms of World War II.
If the president were buried in Arlington, Elliot would emphasize what so many people have said, that he did die on duty and in the course of duty.
It would indeed, and would remove the whole business from the private family context and put him in a national shrine.
I think nobody obviously would object to there being a private family service and burial, and if the president were buried in a family plot, nobody would object. But I think there is there not, a great feeling that the president belongs to the nation.
I'm sure of that, and I'm sure also the decision will be made primarily by Mrs. Kennedy and his brothers.
If he were buried in Arlington, is there now a suitable plot that exists? Would something special have to be set up?
Well, there are plots available for war veterans, and he, of course, qualified. As I said earlier, all we know for certain is that the Attorney General and the Secretary of Defense were at Arlington today and looked at a number of sites, presumably some of the choicer ones.
Ellie, I wish you would join in. I think John Chancellor is on the circuit in Berlin and has had some very interesting things to say about the way in which the communists are reacting, and particularly the Russians are reacting to the death of President Kennedy. John, you said the Soviet government was sending Anastas Mikoyan to represent it at the funeral of President Kennedy. The last time Mikoyan was here was over the Cuba affair. He had to pick up the pieces for Khrushchev after that one.
And was sent to Cuba, by the way, to try to persuade Castro.
Also went to Cuba to pick up the pieces with Castro.
Well, Edwin, I would, if you'll allow me, submit the idea that Anastas Mikoyan, although he may have come here on a difficult errand in connection with the Cuban crisis, has always got along reasonably well with Americans. I think that...
Oh, yes, I think he was sent here at the time of the Cuban crisis because he got along well with Americans. I was only remarking that, he obviously has such a record and such a reputation.
And also, he's a man of considerable rank in the Soviet Union.
I was struck by something you were saying before, John. We on this side, many people on this side, have been worried about the possibility that the Cold War would get hot because of what had happened, and your view and the view of most people is that that is unlikely. It will not get appreciably hotter. But from what you said, I have the impression that the Russians are somewhat worried also, and possibly more worried than we are. Is that a fair statement?
Worried about the effects of the change in administration?
Yes, because the unknown, after all, is on this side, if it is unknown, rather than on their side.
Well, I have no way of knowing what is in Mr. Khrushchev's mind, but it seems to me that they had been able to work out some reasonable agreements with him. They were small, but they were leading in a particular direction. And now, of course, they have quite another quantity to deal with, another human being with a different political chemistry. And I think, however, the general view here, Edwin, is that the technicians and some of the not absolutely top-level policymakers will now take over for a while. This would indeed have happened in the Soviet Union had Khrushchev died suddenly, that the apparatus or establishment takes over for a while because it's very technical and complicated to be a single leader, as Kennedy was, in a sense, and as Khrushchev. And I think Ellie would agree that the role of Dean Rusk in the course of American policy and foreign affairs has been amplified and magnified by this.
Would you agree, Ellie, that Secretary of State Rusk's role is much larger now, especially early in the Johnson administration?
Yes, I would have to agree. President Johnson has sat in over the past 3 years on a great many important policy discussions, but he has not made the kinds of decisions that a president does make. There's no way of training for that kind of job in advance. My guess is that he will lean rather heavily on Secretary of State Rusk and Defense Secretary McNamara and others who over the past 3 years have shared the President Kennedy's burden in making these decisions.
And, Edwin, if I can come in on what Ellie said, for the reason that the known quantities of McNamara and Rusk and a number of other people, that if they have a heavier role in this, they are rather well known and are not likely to go off in a dangerous course from a Soviet or a communist point of view, and therefore I don't think there is any high-level apprehension in Moscow tonight.
John Chancellor, allow me to interrupt just a moment here. This is Russ Ward in New York. I was intrigued by your statement of a moment ago that the communist bloc nations now are allowing VOA broadcasts to get in unjammed. What significance do you attribute to that?
Well, it's part of the general easing of tensions in teeny-weeny little steps, if you want to use an untechnical phrase, that we have achieved over the past year or so with the Soviet Union. And the foreign broadcasts, I believe the Russian language broadcasts are no longer jammed in the Soviet Union. And when the Voice of America broadcasts the details on the man who's accused of murdering the president, they do so much as we do in the United States. We say what we know about him, and therefore I believe that's getting through. This, of course, means that the Russians no longer live in a hermetically sealed society, that they can get these programs if they want to go to a little trouble to get them, and it means that the Russians are going to have to work out a rationale. They came out very quickly. With the minute they learned the pigmentation of that killer in Dallas, Moscow began talking about right-wing elements. And so I might point out that a lot of people in Britain and Germany and France and everywhere else, and editorial writers in newspapers, communist and non-communist, began digging out the files on what they'd done to Adlai Stevenson in Dallas, and this about Dallas and the rest about Dallas. The Soviet propaganda apparatus, working with these materials, very early on in the game, implied fully in their statements and coverage of this that the deed had been done by somebody of the extreme right who was angry with Kennedy for his position on the color problem in the United States. Now, they've got to find a way of taking that back and acknowledging somehow to their own people the fact that this man once lived in the Soviet Union, requested Soviet citizenship, married a Russian girl.
The John State Department authorities said earlier today, and perhaps Ellie Abel will have more on this, said they have no evidence indicating the involvement of the Soviet Union or any other foreign power in the assassination of the president. I wonder if this news has been consumed by the Russian people. Has this been made available in the Russian broadcasts?
I don't know. I would venture to say not in the order of these things. That might be used later by Moscow radio or home service Russian radio, but at this point I don't believe, although I don't have the transcript of their broadcast, that it so far has been used.
Edwin Newman, do you have anything further now from Washington?
I have a question for John. I hope he's still there. John, have you heard anything about communist Chinese reaction to this?
Yes, and I'm trying to think, Ed. The Chinese...
They have been quite restrained, I believe.
They have been extremely restrained, and they are not dealing with the Kennedy story. They are dealing with the Kennedy story, but they are playing it far down in their newscasts, I believe, and are giving it an unimportant position in their newspapers. The importance of that, it seems to me, is the fact that the entire tier of communist states and the Soviet Union itself, which we observed from Berlin, have given a very prominent display to the Kennedy story, and the Chinese are just not doing so.
The view of the Chinese, then, one might judge, is that this really doesn't matter to them. It's not going to make any significant difference to them, and I suppose they would extend from that it should not make any significant difference to any other communist countries, Russia included.
Well, I think from a dogmatic point of view, that's absolutely true. That the Americans are depicted as the international gendarmes, no matter who happens to be at the head of the nation, and that capitalism is a particular kind of evil, no matter how it is clothed or who heads it. So I would say in that sense, yes. I wonder if I might put in a question here to you or to Ellie or to Russ, if it isn't a little bit of showing off, in a way, of taking a story about the death of an American president, which is something that's pretty important to an awful lot of people, including an awful lot of Chinese, and being deliberately insulting about it in a particular way by playing such an important story in such a small way. Are there any thoughts on that?
Well, my first thought on it would be what I have already said, which is that it would be part of the Chinese ideological argument that, in fact, the identity of the President of the United States doesn't really matter to them, that there are, in the first place, larger forces at work, and in the second place, that no possible change that could come about in the United States in personalities would would have that great an effect on policy. I don't think that the Chinese can comfortably argue that a mere change in personality can eliminate what they would have to say are fundamental differences between them and us. And I think they would be obliged to say that the United States is trying to destroy China. That is what they do say. I think, therefore, it is ideologically, communistically, Marxist, Leninistically impossible for them to concede that it makes any difference. That is an awful thing to say, but I think it's true. Ellie, you want to say something?
Well, I think the Chinese, as at present the orthodox party in the communist dispute, have to take the position that the United States is an imperialist power whose policies are determined by monopoly capitalists, as they call them in this country, and they have argued for a very long time that the personality and leanings of the president are quite irrelevant, that imperialists behave like imperialists, no matter who happens to be sitting in the White House. The interesting thing is that the Russians, on the other hand, have been playing this rather differently. Mr. Khrushchev, who'd been missing for several days, and unreported at least, appeared this morning at Spaso House wearing a black suit, signed the book of condolences that Ambassador Kohler had set up at the door, talked privately with Kohler, sent messages to the new president and to the widow Kennedy, expressing his sorrow and that of the peoples of the Soviet Union over the death of a man whom he described as having worked so hard for peace. I think this is an indication in a rather a human vein at the moment, because of the tragedy of the president's death, of the rather different way these are able to behave.
And it is, in a way, I suppose, another bone of contention between them, that the Chinese might well feel that the way in which the Russians are conducting themselves is not a way for a communist power to conduct itself.
Are we holding a lot of people up, or could I ask a question?
Russ Ward, I think you're in command. Are we holding other people up?
We're holding no one up, and the microphone is yours, John.
Well, I'd like to ask all of you what reaction you had, and I haven't been able to hear the coverage, so perhaps you've gone through this, but the original reaction you had when you learned of the president's death, did you feel that suddenly that the Russians might do something, that the Russians might take advantage of the fact that he'd just been killed to do some awful and not really well-defined thing to us? Was there any feeling like that in the United States?
Russ, why don't you answer that?
I don't think so, John. I think this country has a history of bipartisan support in most foreign policy, certainly in our dealings with the Soviet Union. I think the death of the president was more a personal thing, not one that could be translated in terms of what do we do now in Berlin, or what do we do now about Formosa, or what do we do about the Soviet Union or Cuba. I think that by and large, everyone in official Washington and everyone else is dedicated to the freedom of Berlin, is dedicated to the freedom of this country in its fight against international communism, I don't think for a minute that there were thoughts of sudden collapse of our foreign policy. Ellie, you probably have more to say on that than any of us.
Russ Ellie's had to go, has had to answer a call. He has a number of people on the line from whom he's getting information. I think the answer to my answer to John's question would be that at the time President Kennedy was killed, I do not believe that anybody thought that any foreign power had anything to do with it. At least I don't know of anybody who thought that. I didn't hear it suggested. I think a great many people had the same reaction, that the same feeling that the Russians so apparently unwisely did, that it was something that came from perhaps the extreme right, somebody crazed but on the extreme right. That was a reading that so far at least appears to have been false. But I think since everybody was stunned and astonished and at first unbelieving, that it didn't occur to anyone that this might be any sort of international plot, or that the Russians would try to take advantage of it, because that would be too transparent a thing and too dangerous a thing to do. Anybody who tried to take advantage of it might well be associated in the public mind with the idea that they were responsible for it.
Edwin and John, too, the immediate reaction that I heard in Washington was one that possibly it was a person who was irate over President Kennedy's civil rights program. As it turns out, if what we hear from Dallas is true, this seemed to have a negligible role in what took place, if any role at all.
I'd like to rephrase my question, if I may. I didn't mean to imply when I said it, prompting these interesting and significant answers of yours, that I had believed that the Soviet Union had any, causal relationship with the shooting, but I was interested in the attitude of the American people. We tend, under our system, more and more nuclear weapons make us do this, I believe, to think of the president as a man who has a button, and if he presses that button, all kinds of things go off, and we're in a war, and that Khrushchev has a button. And when one of the two men in the world who control these enormous arsenals of nuclear weapons dies, and there is this moment of uncertainty that follows his death about, excuse me for phrasing it this way, but who's got the button? Did any of these thoughts go through the minds of people you knew or your own minds? And I'm not talking now vis-a-vis the Russians or any plot or any foreign policy things. You see what I'm getting at, Edwin?
I see what you're getting at, John, and I do not know of anybody to whom that idea occurred, with the exception of the Germans, apparently, who took certain precautionary measures and put their armed forces, so we understand from Wells, hanging on a very high alert called Alert 1. That is, I suppose, a reasonable enough precaution to take when you are that close and when you don't know what is happening. But I am not aware of anybody who thought that the Russians would try to exploit this. What I was trying to say before was that I think the danger of trying to exploit it would have been overwhelming. I think anybody who tried to exploit it might have been accused of being responsible for it. In any case, I don't think anybody could try to exploit it without running the gravest sort of risks. Of course, we did have Pearl Harbor. People don't always stop to tell you what they intend to do to you. But the danger of the scope of the size of the reaction now is so much greater and so much more lethal that it is hard to see anybody doing anything of a risky nature.
Well, then what we're really saying, I think, is that the securities and the dangers of the world situation are really so gigantic now that the death of one man, no matter how much we may miss him, are not really going to change that balance.
They may not change it immediately, John. It is possible that they will change it in a variety of subtle ways later on because of shifting weights, shifting authorities within the, within the Western Alliance. That if, for example, President Johnson should be a less effective leader than President Kennedy has been, if American influence in the alliance should wane, issues should arise between our allies and ourselves that cannot be resolved and that make tempers shorter on both sides, all of those things could certainly affect the future, and so the passing of President Kennedy could certainly affect the future. I think there was also something you mentioned before, that now the personal chemistry between Mr. Johnson and Khrushchev comes into the picture.
Well,
right?
yes,
ahead,
I think
please. What I was going to say was that President Kennedy and Mr. Khrushchev knew each other quite well, and apparently understood each other reasonably well. At least they have for the last year.
Well, they were in, to use again a non-technical term, they were pen pals. They had met, as I recall, only once at Vienna. Isn't that right?
Yes, at Vienna.
And in a very strained meeting, which I remember being there, and how we all recall how shocked and how sober the president was when he came away from that meeting. And actually, I think you're quite right in what you say, however, is that they had learned one another in a very interesting and in a kind of an intimate way. And the chemistry is going to have to be reworked again. Isn't that what you mean?
Yes, and we don't know what will come out of that. You were at Vienna, so was I, and as you say, the president was shaken and shocked, and must have been greatly saddened, but also made quite determined by what he learned there. But I think if we look back on that, we will believe that that was Khrushchev trying to take Mr. Kennedy's measure. We may now have to wait, if Khrushchev is so inclined, for him to take Mr. Johnson's measure. And until he does, we may not be able to know how well they're going to get along. And how well they get along will have a great deal to do with the future of all of us.
I agree absolutely, and would only add to that when I was talking about the death of one man not changing the balances of the world, I meant that, of course, quite in the present.
Yes.
John, before we lose you here, speaking of this personal chemistry that you and Edwin were talking about a minute ago, how would you define the chemistry between Lyndon Johnson and the people of West Berlin? Do they feel they have as strong a friend in Lyndon Johnson as they had in John F. Kennedy?
Well, the answer is, it really has to be a two-part answer. The first is no. Their manifestation of affection for Kennedy has been phenomenal. Last night at 1 a.m, we had 40,000 people in a torchlight ceremony here in front of the City Hall, and I defy you to find any city in the world last night, including Washington, D.C. or Boston, where 40,000 people gathered together in mute adoration of a man. So I think that no one could take his place in their hearts in this emotional week or weekend. Now, I remember Lyndon Johnson when he was sent here after the wall went up in Berlin, and he was here on the 19th of August, 1961, as a demonstration of American support. Then, at that point, he was, I believe, very effective with the people of West Berlin. We had been up to see the wall. The caravan turned and came back toward the center of Berlin, and Lyndon Johnson, then the vice president, was riding in a closed car. The people of Berlin, in that terribly emotional week when the wall went up, were lining the streets of Berlin, West Berlin, and he felt that, and the kind of again, if we're talking about chemistry, overcame him, and also his very natural inclination to politic wherever he is. He asked his driver to stop the car, and he got out, and of course there was a mob scene, and he walked for 3 or 4 blocks down the street shaking hands with the people of West Berlin. I've had a number of people here in this city speak to me about that incident. They couldn't all have been there, but they saw it on television and read about it in their newspapers, and I would say that President Johnson has a reservoir of affection here in the people of Berlin that is something quite valuable for him, and it was based mainly on that one trip. Of course, he's known Willy Brandt for years, but the main thing was that one trip after the wall.
John, thank you for that appraisal. Edwin, do you have anything else to add from Washington?
Not at this moment, Russ.
We'll be coming back to both of you later in the day. I might bring you right now this New York Times report from Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of President Kennedy, made an informal plea today to communicate with an unidentified individual in New York City, this according to the New York Times. As he was being led handcuffed from a renewed police interrogation this morning, the 24-year-old warehouse worker paused in front of television cameras in a police department corridor and said, "I want to talk to Mr." And then there's a blank in New York City. The name he mentioned sounded something like Aft or Apt, but before he could be clarified, Oswald was pushed on by detectives.
Russ Ward.
Yes.
This is Newman in Washington. I saw that story, and the story I saw spelled the name of the lawyer, I take it was a lawyer, A-P-T. In fact, there is a well-known lawyer in New York who spells his name A-B-T, and who has been the attorney in many cases involving left-wing people. I don't want to go beyond that. My memory doesn't entirely hold up on this, but it is. I'm almost sure the man he had in mind spelled his name A-B-T, and is an extremely well-known lawyer. Has been here in Washington in a number of cases, and I think that must be the man he had in mind. I believe his first name is John.
That's very interesting. It would seem to further indicate the allegiance that Lee Harvey Oswald had with communist causes.
The following is a note for stations. For those local stations that might have some local news or public service announcements of local importance, we will provide stations with approximately 4 minutes for this purpose. It's 5 minutes before the hour and half hour. The network will, however, continue coverage during this period. The following is the cutaway cue. You're listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Bob, do I hear behind you that the President is coming?
He is just walking across, yes. We are looking out the press room window now. He is coming across West Executive Avenue from the Executive Office Building. He is entering the White House from through the west door on the street level. The fish room is prepared now. The cameras are getting set. Our microphones are in order, and we would imagine that it just will take him now a matter of a minute or even less before he comes up from West Executive Avenue, that entrance there, and then into the fish room. Hoping to see more now. He is in the White House now. Bryson Lash is standing next to me with a better view. We don't know anything more about the meeting with former President Truman as yet. We're assuming for the moment that it will be held immediately after the proclamation is read. Bryson?
I should assume so. It's impossible to identify anyone as they walk across the street. There's a great group of men coming across under umbrellas with raincoats on in this driving rain, and it's darkness settling over the city, and it's just impossible to identify anyone. Anyone could be with the President at the moment. But he's now in the White House, coming up in the elevator. He'll be in the fish room in a matter of moments.
The rain has not only made us awfully wet here, we're soaked through, but it's made identification extremely difficult, as Bryson has pointed out. At the north portico, most of the persons there have their windows rolled up. The inside is steaming. And now we're here. The President is now entering the fish room of the White House. He is walking to the battery of microphones. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
To the people of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, has been taken from us by an act which outrages decent men everywhere. He upheld the faith of our fathers, which is freedom for all men. He broadened the frontiers of that faith, and he backed it with the energy and the courage which are the mark of the nation that he led. A man of wisdom, strength, and peace, he molded and moved the power of our nation in the service of a world of growing liberty and order. All who love freedom will mourn his death. As he did not shrink from his responsibilities, but welcomed them, so he would have us not shrink from carrying on his work beyond this hour of national tragedy. He said it himself. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. Now, therefore, I, Lyndon B. Johnson, President of the United States of America, do appoint Monday next, November 25, the day of the funeral service of President Kennedy, to be a national day of mourning throughout the United States. I earnestly recommend the people to assemble on that day in their respective places of divine worship, there to bow down in submission to the will of Almighty God, and to pay their homage of love and reverence to the memory of a great and good man. I invite the people of the world who share our grief to join us in this day of mourning and rededication. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States of America to be affixed. Done at the city of Washington, this the 23rd day of November, in the year of our Lord 1963, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 188th.
That was the President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, reading a proclamation issued earlier this afternoon, proclaiming Monday, November 25th, as a day of mourning for President Kennedy. As President Johnson read the proclamation, when he said, "We offer reverence to the memory of a great and good man," he was filled with emotion. We thought for a moment that he might break down and cry, or in some way show his emotions and manifest themselves in a more obvious way. Tears seemed to come to his eyes at that moment when he referred to a great and good man. He paused and looked straight ahead when he said it. He referred to the President as a man of wisdom, strength, and peace. That's it from the White House, Ed Newman.
We've just heard here in the NBC newsroom in Washington that President Johnson plans to address a joint session of Congress next week. That information comes from a top leader in the administration. He said it is still not certain whether Mr. Johnson will make his first congressional appearance as president on Wednesday or Friday, but it probably will be on Wednesday. He said he did not expect it to be a program speech or a partisan speech. That is to say, it will not deal with legislative matters. He thought the president would make a plea for national unity. Now back to Jim Hurlbut in New York.
And Ed Newman will have a report from Hyannisport in just a moment.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight.
Edwin, perhaps the most shocked of anyone at the death of the President, aside from his family, that is, was the Secret Service assigned to guard him during this, what was hoped to be a joyous trip to Texas. And for more than 2 weeks before the trip, Secret Service agents had been working quietly in the city of Dallas to prevent the very thing that did happen yesterday, the assassination of the President. They had inspected the site for the President's speech. They had carefully looked over the route of his motorcade, talked to individuals whom they knew the President would come into contact with, even kept a log of all known troublemakers in the Dallas area so they could check their whereabouts and their habits. At first, the Secret Service even had vetoed the site of President Kennedy's speech, the Dallas Trade Mart, on the grounds that there were too many balconies from which a possible assassin might hide. They gave in on the site of the speech only after making sure that each one of the 14 entrances to the building would be covered, that all persons coming and going could be kept under constant surveillance. The Secret Service personnel supervised the selection of the menu that the President enjoyed while he was there. They overlooked the preparation of the food to make sure that the president received nothing different from that eaten by others. For example, there was no special steak prepared for the president on Thursday evening. It was picked from among thousands that were being prepared for dinner guests that night, picked at random. They made sure that all points along the route of the president's motorcade were carefully guarded, especially the points of underpass that the bubble-top limousine had to pass. All congested intersections and places where crowds would gather had an extra complement of police. They even enlisted 350 policemen from the Dallas force to be on hand the day of the assassination. Everything carefully covered, but of course impossible to watch each one of tens of thousands of windows which overlook the route of the motorcade, and from one of those windows the assassin's bullet. We might read to you a letter received by Senator John Tower of Texas some months ago, written by Lee Harvey Oswald, a man being held in Dallas, charged with murder in connection with the assassination. Oswald at the time was in the Soviet Union, and he wrote to Senator Tower of Texas as follows. My name is Lee Harvey Oswald, 22, of Fort Worth, up until October of 1959, when I came to the Soviet Union for a residual document for a non-Soviet persons living for a time in the USSR. The American Embassy in Moscow is familiar with my case. Since July 20th, 1960, I have unsuccessfully applied for a Soviet exit visa to leave this country. The Soviet refuses to permit me and my Soviet wife, who applied at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow on July 8th, 1960, for immigration status to the USA, to leave the Soviet Union. I am a citizen of the United States of America, and I beseech you, Senator Tower, to raise the question of holding by the Soviet Union of a citizen of the U.S. against his will and expressed desires. And it's signed, yours very truly, Lee H. Oswald. The 24-year-old man, at the time he wrote the letter, he was 22, now 2 years later, being held in Dallas, Texas, charged with the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We might add that Oswald protests his innocence, says he did not kill the president nor anyone else. We might also mention that Texas does have capital punishment in the form of electrocution. The ailing 75-year-old father of the president has been told that his son is dead from an assassin's bullet. Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the president's mother, Senator Edward Kennedy, their son, and a daughter, Eunice Shriver, all were present at the time. A neurologist, Dr. Russell Bowles, Jr. of Boston, stood by as the sad word was given to the elder Mr. Kennedy. His reaction was not made public. Mr. Joseph P. Kennedy, whose life filled with both success and grief, advised of his son's death shortly after Mrs. Kennedy returned from St. Francis Xavier's Church, where she had attended 2 masses this morning. More on this tragic story now as we go back to Dallas and NBC's Tom Pettit.
Now, what is your speculation as to what the motive may have been?
I try not to speculate on any crime. I don't think it pays to speculate on a crime.
Is there any feeling among the Dallas police force that this might have been avoided?
None that I know of. As far as being avoided, certainly you might say that it could have been avoided had you had someone in every window and every building. But the feeling among the Dallas Police Department, as it is with every other citizen in the country, is one of deep grief and deep regret.
Thank you very much, Chief M.W. Stevenson, Deputy Chief of the Dallas Police Department. That is the picture at this hour at Dallas Police Headquarters. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News.
One of the noticeable and striking aspects of the events since the murder of President Kennedy has been the part played by his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. it is on Robert Kennedy that Mrs. Kennedy has most relied. He was at the airport last night when she came in. And he has, as far as we know, been with her almost continuously since. There will be we're just told, a press briefing, that is to say a meeting with the reporters at the White House by the White House News Secretary, Pierre Salinger, in about an hour and a half, an hour and 40 minutes from now. And we may at that time receive information as to the definite funeral plans for the president. What we do not know at this moment, it has not been specifically stated where the president is to be buried. The presumption is that it will be in the Kennedy family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts, but that has not been specifically announced. The body is to be taken tomorrow to the Capitol. That will be there for about 21 hours. Funeral services are to be held late on Monday morning at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. And probably the president will be buried in the Kennedy family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts, but that has not been specifically announced. We are told that it was Attorney General Kennedy who was at the side of Mrs. Kennedy at the White House. Is Robert Goralski on this line? Can he hear me? Can Robert Goralski hear me?
Yes, I can, Ed. Go ahead.
Robert, do you know, has Mrs. Kennedy gone into the East Room?
I've been standing out here for the last half hour or so, Ed, and the only member of the Kennedy family that I've seen arrive here at the North Portico has been one of the children of Attorney General Robert Kennedy. That was about 15 minutes ago. I would imagine that most of the family came here quite early this morning, and they have been in the White House for quite some time, and went directly then to the East Room at 10 o'clock, at which time they saw the president's body lying in repose. The newsmen were admitted to the East Room a little after 9 o'clock, and there we saw the catafalque. The casket is draped in an American flag. At each corner, a member of the Armed Services, a member of the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force standing at rigid attention. And while we were in there, there were two priests of the Roman Catholic Church who were praying on two portable kneeling arrangements that had been brought in late last night by two priests from St. Matthew's Cathedral. It will be at St. Matthew's that the president will be, that the Requiem Mass for the president will be said on Monday.
We have just received word from Dallas that the gravely wounded Governor John Connally has been told by his wife that President Kennedy is dead. Mrs. Connally talked to the Texas governor shortly after 7 o'clock this morning, Dallas time, and Connally's first question was about the president's condition. After hearing the answer from his wife, he said, "That's what I was afraid of." One of Connally's aides, Julian Reed, describes Governor Connally's condition this morning as much improved. He said that the governor also asked about Mrs. Kennedy and was told that she had returned to Washington. Several of Connally's relatives hurried to Dallas yesterday. These include four brothers, his sister, and his mother. Said Reed, the first Mrs. Connally knew of any shooting was when her husband whirled and saw the president fall forward. This must have been about 2 seconds after President Kennedy was shot. Connally's turn, which was to the left, probably saved his own life. After the governor was shot, he also toppled forward. Reed said the most discomforting thing for Connally is that his right arm is suspended by ropes and pulleys in a cast from above the elbow to below the wrist. Reed said Connally called the cast heavy and bothersome. We have further word now on this new development from Dallas. Let's go to Dallas and John Perryman.
Russ, the latest information we have is that the Dallas City Police say they have a photograph of Oswald holding a rifle with a telescopic sight. The rifle resembles the weapon used to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. We don't know if it can be determined if this is the same rifle that was found in the warehouse where the assassin shot the fatal bullets into the president. But they do have a photograph, they tell us, that shows Oswald holding a rifle as though aiming at something When the picture was made, we don't know, but that is the latest information from the Dallas Police Department.
As the police in Dallas have disclosed the evidence in bits and pieces today, that evidence seems to come this way, comes together this way, that his wife said that he had owned a rifle similar to the one used by the sniper who shot President Kennedy. And the police know that Oswald bought a rifle for $12.78 from a mail-order house. The police say that that order was in Oswald's handwriting. The rifle was not in its accustomed place in a garage where he normally kept it. Police say that they found the death rifle in a room overlooking the assassination site. Then paraffin tests for gunpowder on his hands were positive, according to the police. And then, as Russ Ward reported only a moment ago, the police disclosed that they now had a photograph of Oswald posing with the rifle and with a pistol used to slay a pursuing policeman after the assassination. Now, on the legal ramifications of the Oswald case and his forthcoming trial, I talked to outstanding legal authority here in Washington. He made these points. He said that Oswald, of course, must be tried by a jury, and this poses a not too difficult problem because the judge can handle the matter of a prejudiced juror by following one of three alternatives. First, he can switch the place of the trial, say to Houston, if he's convinced that Oswald could not get a fair trial in Dallas, and or he could, number two, say that it will do no good to grant a change of venue. And then third, and most likely, he could grant a continuance of this trial until the burning indignation dies down. And if he follows that course, a conviction undoubtedly would stand up in any of those three cases. However, the way the case is actually being handled in Dallas, as my legal friend sees it, is flirting with danger. There was, for instance, the statement by the Dallas police chief that Oswald's case is a cinch. Well, such statements like that might prejudice the trial in the eyes of some appeals court. Also, television film has been somewhat objectionable from a legal standpoint to a fair trial. Apparently, the only way to move Oswald through the jail where he's being held is to take him through a corridor, which, of course, is always jammed with cameramen and reporters. So the public, and of course the public are prospective jurors down in Dallas, they hear questions shouted at Oswald by the newsmen. They see him pushed and banged into the wall by the crowd. Now, there may be a parallel here developing to a Louisiana murder case in which the Supreme Court ruled last year. It seems that a Louisiana suspect in the murder case was filmed making a confession, making a confession. The film was then shown on television at least twice in Louisiana prior to the man's trial and conviction. The Supreme Court here in Washington then set aside the conviction on the basis of that televised confession. Now, my lawyer friend is convinced that the Dallas police are trying to wring a confession from Oswald, and if one is obtained, that there can be serious legal doubts about his confession and possibly create a case, if he confesses and then is convicted, that could be lead to an appeals court, and possibly the case could end up in the United States Supreme Court as the Louisiana murder case did.
Oswald now has been charged with attempting to kill Texas Governor John Connally. This is the third charge brought against him, that of murdering the president, of killing the Dallas policeman, and now with attempted murder on the life of Governor Connally.
Yes.
This last charge filed just this afternoon. Peter, did you have anything you can add to this legal discussion we have going?
Not specifically, Russ. We discussed this earlier, Jim Hurlbut and I, and the question arose without any answers, of course, neither of us being legal minds or legally trained, as to just how much of a fair trial, legally speaking, this fellow can expect, because of the fact that our communications today are what they are. Within minutes of what happens, as a matter of fact, even as it's happening, the people not only of the general area of Dallas, but of the entire country are
watching it either live or momentarily. And the question that I raised, and Jim had no answer, nor do I. From a legal standpoint, won't it be rather difficult to pick a jury which Mr. Oswald's attorneys feel are not prejudiced in advance? It will be difficult.
I would imagine it would be impossible because the name, the face, the voice, and the story have been carried on all broadcast radio and television for many hours now.
Well, this is a problem for legal minds, a very delicate one, and obviously the presiding judge in the case is going to have to be very careful because of all of the ramifications of appeals and legal technicalities which would then ensue.
Peter, allow me to interrupt here. We have Tom Perryman in Dallas on the line, and he has a continuation of this Lee Harvey Oswald story. We'll call in Tom right now.
Thank you, Russ. Well, here in Dallas, we had a man, Travis Lynn, was down at the Dallas Police Headquarters, and he noted from the police blotter, the report sheet, that the police always fill out when there's a homicide or a theft or anything else in the police work nature. These reports are filled out on everything that takes place with all the facts. And we have a recording here, 1 minute and 27 seconds long, we want you to hear. It goes like this.
Whenever an offense is committed in the city of Dallas, or a homicide report is made out in case it is a murder, commonly called a beef sheet at police headquarters, there is now one on the assassination of President Kennedy. It reads in this fashion. Last name of person killed, Kennedy, John F., in parentheses, President of U.S., white male, 47, Washington, D.C., residence of person killed, White House. Serial number, felony offense 85950. Offense as reported, murder. Place of occurrence, Elm Street, approximately 150 feet west of Houston. Division, Homicide and Robbery, Platoon 2, Beat 101. Officers making report, C.N. Doherty and H.H. Blessing, Dallas Police Department. Day of week, Friday, 11/22/63 at 12:30 p.m. Coroner notified Joe B. Brown, pronounced dead by Dr. Kemp Clark at 1 p.m. Parkland Hospital. A description of the offense, the expired was riding in motorcade with wife and Governor John Connally and his wife. Witnesses heard gunshot and saw expired son forward. More shots were heard and expired fell into wife's lap. Governor Connally also was shot at this time. Car in which they were riding was escorted to Parkland Hospital by Dallas police officers. Person arrested, Lee Harvey Oswald, white male, 25. Arresting officers, Lieutenant E.L. Cunningham and M.N. McDonald, patrolman. Charge, murder.
And that's the official report from Dallas Police Headquarters. One final note, Russ. Oswald will be transferred to the county jail at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was thought he might be transferred tonight, but late word from police headquarters indicates he'll be taken over to the county jail, just literally feet away from where the assassination took place, at 10 o'clock in the morning.
We understand Oswald lost some of what was described earlier as his arrogant air after he had seen the photographs of himself with the rifle that is being held. Do you have any further enlightenment on that?
Yes, he made a statement over in Police Captain Will Fritz's office to the effect that he wanted a lawyer. He was seeking the lawyer from New York, Mr. Apt, who has represented people with communistic backgrounds, and he appeared to have calmed down some.
We go immediately back to Dallas now, and the police chief there with further details on this murder weapon.
Chief Curry, I understand you have some new information in this case. Could you relate what that is?
Yes, we've just been informed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation that they, the FBI, have the order letter from a mail order house, and this the order was sent to their laboratory in Washington, and the writing on this order was compared with known samples of our suspect Oswald's handwriting and found to be the same.
This order was for the rifle?
This order was for the rifle to a mail order house in Chicago. It was, the return address was to Dallas, Texas, to the post office box under the name of A. Hidell, Hidell. This is the post office box of our suspect. It was This gun was mailed parcel post on March the 20th, 1963. I understand he left Dallas shortly after this and didn't come back until, I think, about 2 months ago.
Do you know, again, on what date this rifle was ordered, and are you able to link it definitely as the rifle which you confiscated at the schoolbook depository?
That we have not done so far. If the FBI has been able to do it, I have not been informed of it yet. We do know that this man ordered a rifle of the type that was used in the assassination of the president from this mail-order house in Chicago, and the FBI has definitely identified the writing as that of our suspect.
On another subject, I understand you have photographs of the suspect Oswald with a rifle like that used. Could you describe that picture?
Well, this is a picture of Oswald standing facing a camera with a rifle in his hand, which is very similar to the rifle that we have in our possession. He also had a pistol strapped on his hip. He was holding two papers in his hand, which one of them seemed to be the worker. The other says, be militant, or I don't know whether that was headlines or the name of the paper.
How much did the gun cost from the mail-order house?
I understand the gun was advertised for $12.78, I believe.
Have you received any results on the ballistics test conducted on the gun and on Oswald?
They're going to be favorable. I don't have a formal report yet.
But you are sure at this time they will be favorable?
Yes.
Do you feel now that you have the case completely wrapped up, or are you continuing?
We will continue as long as there's a shred of evidence to be gathered. We have a strong case at this time.
I believe you said early this afternoon that you have a new development which does wrap up the case. The first time you said the case definitely is secure. Is that correct?
That was this morning. This additional evidence just makes a stronger case.
But this is not the same evidence you're referring to then?
No, that's true.
Will you be willing to say what that evidence was?
No, sir, I don't wish to reveal it. It might jeopardize our case.
Thank you very much. Chief Jesse Curry of the Dallas Police Department.
Chief Curry describing the murder weapon as a $12.78 gun purchased from a mail-order house in Chicago. Another recap now as we look back over the events of the past few hours surrounding the death of the late president. John Kennedy to receive a hero's burial Monday in Arlington National Cemetery just across the Potomac River from Washington. As Commander-in-Chief of the nation's armed forces, the president had abundant right to a grave in the honored military cemetery, both a veteran and a war hero as well. During World War II, as a Navy lieutenant, John Kennedy commanded a PT that was rammed and wrecked by an enemy craft. It was through his heroic efforts that his men were rescued. Burial to follow a pontifical requiem mass at Washington's St. Matthew's Cathedral at noon on Monday, Washington time. Monday to be a day of mourning across the nation and around the world. President Lyndon B. Johnson has appealed to the American people to go to their respective houses of worship for prayer. He also invited all people everywhere to share this nation's grief and to join in the mourning. The new president will make a major policy speech before both houses of Congress on Wednesday. The White House announced the speech will be delivered at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Today, President Johnson held his first cabinet meeting and proclaimed Monday a day of mourning for the dead president. The half-hour cabinet meeting in the White House opened with a minute of silent prayer for Mr. Kennedy. In his proclamation, Mr. Johnson asked Americans to pay tribute to President Kennedy on Monday, the day of his funeral. He also ordered the federal government to close its offices on that day. Mr. Johnson met with two former presidents today, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, and he consoled the widowed First Lady and the two Kennedy children. It's expected President Johnson will pursue the legislative policies of his predecessor. Any changes in his policies are not expected to show up for January when he makes his first State of the Union message. It is expected President Johnson's congressional background will put him on a solid footing in getting his programs through Congress. Some observers are saying he might be able to get Congress to act on the programs of President Kennedy, which currently are being held back. Congress to meet for regular sessions Tuesday and in at joint session Wednesday to hear the new president. The House Speaker, John McCormick, says the House will work briefly on Wednesday and adjourn then until Friday after Thanksgiving. More on the man now being held in Dallas, Texas, in connection with the assassination of the president, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald. In an interview in New York, lawyer John App was asked tonight about undertaking the defense of Oswald. He said, quote, "I don't see how it would be possible to undertake a case of this magnitude." He said he had not been asked to do so, and he added, "It would have to be a very serious decision." Apt went on to say, "I have a very heavy litigation schedule." He declared that assuming the Oswald case would not be fair to his other clients. 24-year-old Lee Harvey Apt being held by Dallas authorities on 3 charges. Lee Harvey Oswald being held in Dallas on 3 charges: the assassination of President Kennedy, the murder of a Dallas policeman, and attempted murder on the life of Governor John Connally of Texas. Continuous coverage coming your way on the events surrounding the death of the president. This is Russ Ward, NBC News, New York.
As you know, the NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.